Okay, and just to wrap up this idea of epistemology, one of the examples that I like to use is this idea of brushing your teeth, which is sort of seen as a commonplace activity uh, in our everyday, or rather, not just brushing the teeth, or rather the toothpaste. And so we sort of use the toothpaste and don't necessarily think about all the chemical components that are sort of comprised in toothpaste, right? And yet, if somebody were to sort of just sort of tell us, hey, why don't you use this nitrogen oxide to clean your mouth? And we had never even heard of nitrogen oxide. We'd probably be a lot more hesitant to actually use it to sort of clean our teeth, right? And yet we do it sort of on an everyday without question. We put all of these chemicals within our mouth, and we're pretty sure that it's going to clean, our teeth. And we're sure because we've sort of depended on scientific research that says it's not going to kill us. Plus, once we actually sort of brush our teeth, even if we sort of swallow some, we haven't necessarily died, right? So we still sort of think we're okay. And we oftentimes will sort of think that if people don't sort of use toothpaste to sort of brush their mouth, then perhaps their mouth isn't necessarily clean. So we might read about a culture, and there's many sort of cultures that don't use toothpaste, that will use something, some cultures will use something called like a chewing stick, which sort of chew on a particular kind of stick that's sort of, it comes from the earth, but it's much more natural. And so we might sort of read about that culture and read about, well, okay, that's sort of what they do. But in our mind's eye, again, we'll sort of say, but I'm not going to use that chewing stick, right? I'm going to stick with this toothpaste. Even though I really have no idea exactly what I'm putting into my mouth. I'm going to sort of trust that these chemicals will sort of do what they do. And that sort of unquestioning, particularly around science, is something that we're going to talk a lot more about once we get into the Enlightenment. But this example also lends itself into this other keyword that I want us to think about, which is epistemological ethnocentrism. So it's very much tied to our first keyword, epistemology, in the sense that it's sort of about these sort of taken for granted assumptions that we just sort of have about what people do and why people do things and how they should do things, like brushing your teeth. Epistemological ethnocentrism sort of brings in this other concept of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is this idea that you sort of use your own culture to become a standard for analysis. And when you do that, what you will oftentimes do is sort of place your own culture as superior to another folks' culture. Like the toothpaste example, or even with the example with school. Remember how we talked about one of the important reasons why we look at the distinction between education and school is to sort of understand that even populations or cultures that don't necessarily or haven't used school or don't use school as a form of education, that those people are then sort of uneducated. Epistemological ethnocentrism is sort of linked to the idea that if people don't necessarily have or do things or sort of do things differently within their own culture, then they are somehow deviant from this standard. Again, this standard having been our own culture. And I think that happens very often, particularly within the United States, because the United States is sort of very focused on the United States. We think about how it is sort of rare for students to speak more than one language. Yet in majority of other countries throughout the world, it's rare to find anybody who only speaks one language. That many people will sort of speak multiple languages. that sort of countries throughout the world have a lot more of a global sense in terms of history with other countries, not just sort of their own. And here in the United States, there isn't so much of a focus to sort of, understand the histories of other countries. Yes, we have global studies. Yes, we have world history as high school courses. But they still tend to sort of serve as survey courses and don't necessarily get into the current politics of some of those countries, right? Um, and so I think it's sort of very normal for epistemological ethnocentrism to sort of occur within many students and within many teachers, particularly for folks who haven't necessarily been exposed to many cultures. What becomes your standard is sort of what you know, right? But again, one of the ways that we can sort of see that at work is through language. An example that I love to use is the World Series. World Series, baseball, America's one of America's favorite pastimes. And the title has always been really curious to me because the World Series only involves one country and does not involve any other country in the world. And so this level of entitlement to be able to sort of create a title like the World Series within the United States is a pretty good example of epistemological ethnocentrism because of how it equates the United States with the world, right? And so I can sort of, and I can sort of see arguments for, that it's a very immigrating country, right? It's sort of very diverse. We have people from literally all over the world who sort of come to the United States. But I'm not sure if I always sort of see that reflected within those baseball teams. And I'm not sure if that was necessarily the reasoning behind, that title. But either way, the very fact that title goes unquestioned, the very idea that it doesn't bother us, or that it's, so commonplace to sort of say, well, yeah, it's the World Series, even though it's only one country, is again us being sort of fishes in this fishbowl. Yep. Again, this becomes important as we're looking at Indigenous education, because oftentimes the arguments will sort of be, well, Indigenous education was good for back then, and it was good for those people, but that style of learning or that structure of education isn't something that can sort of work within our current times, because our current times call for sort of more understandings around technology. Our current times are a lot more scientifically advanced, and those more spiritual beliefs sort of contradict themselves. And so I want us to be very careful in sort of saying what we can or can't use when it comes to sort of Indigenous education, in terms of what we can learn from them. But the other idea that I wanted to think about in terms of Indigenous education as well, and this was sort of leading into the second article, is how we even learn about Indigenous peoples. And one of the earliest moments that we sort of learn about Indigenous peoples here in this country oftentimes is around Thanksgiving. And that is a very interesting topic, particularly as we consider elementary school teachers as being the teachers who start that conversation and ultimately become children's very first history teachers. And so how do we go about history? How do we go about sort of teaching history? Particularly a history that is, one, often glorified, because two, it's often not as pretty as we would like for it to be.